Good morning. If everybody can take their seat, please, we'll get started here in a minute. All right, I hope you've all picked up your programs. We have programs of the bios of all our panelists this morning. It also includes a survey sheet, which we hope you'll complete after the seminar and return to the front desk. Some of our speakers have also left some materials and other goodies, so please pick those items up, what you would like. We've also included our new Citizens Report, which is a quick review of the county's financial statements. And finally, we'll be live tweeting this morning the event, so we'd love if you would participate in that way. And feel free to post questions, comments using the hashtag, and we'll get to those questions to our panelists if possible. But I'd like to begin by introducing our chairwoman of the Board of Supervisors, Lisa Bartlett, from the fabulous 5th District, representing the Gold Coast, Southern Orange County, and she would like to do an intro this morning.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here this morning as your chairwoman of the Orange County Board of Supervisors and also as your 5th District Supervisor. And it's an honor to welcome you to the Fraud Symposium hosted by our esteemed Auditor-Controller, Eric Woolery, and also ACCOC. And I'm past president of ACCOC as well. It's a wonderful Orange County-based organization that really does a lot of grassroots up work out in the community and does a great job. Since taking office, Eric has done a spectacular job of ensuring that his department is meeting their mission to promote public oversight, provide accountability, and support financial decision-making for the county. And the Fraud Symposium is really important today because, as you know, fraud is everywhere. We've always received calls from a stranded relative that's internationally and they need you to wire funds in, or the IRS is supposedly calling you, wanting your credit card number because you're short on your tax return dollars. And credit cards too. I get that all the time as well, where you get a fraud alert on your credit card. So unfortunately, fraud is a way of life these days, both in the public side of things and also in your private lives. Over at OCTA, we had an issue with regard to fraud and cybersecurity issues that we had to get under control. And it's the type of thing where even though you set up certain mechanisms within your infrastructure, things still happen. And you have to be aware of things that can occur and how to mitigate those potential damages that could occur, whether it be a public agency or a private company. As public agencies, we must remain vigilant and continuous to access our networks, plan for vulnerability, and also to develop a roadmap to recovery should an event take place. We've had a lot of events with public agencies recently. There was some multi-millions of dollars of embezzlement to the city of Placentia. Now they've got safeguards in place, but it puts all of us on notice that we need to have our own safeguards here at the county. And Eric, as our Auditor-Controller, has done a great job of ensuring that at the county we've got a lot of these safeguards in place so we won't have some of the issues that a lot of these other public agencies have encountered. The county has a $6 billion budget, so when you talk about vulnerability, with a $6 billion budget, a lot of money flowing through our systems here with vendors and contractors and people that we work with at the county, we have a lot of vulnerability here at the county. A lot of dollars are coming and going every day through our budgeting process, and we want to make sure that when we pay a bill, it's for services that have been rendered and the products that we've received. So a lot of checks and balances need to be in place, and we're working on that not only through the Board of Supervisors, but also checks and balances through the Auditor-Controller's office, because it's a multi-pronged approach to ensure that we get all of our bases covered here at the county. Orange County is the 6th largest county in America, so when you think about the vulnerability that we have, we're larger than 22 states with regard to population. So we've got a lot going on here at the county level. But these steps require education, of course, to the latest technologies to create awareness of common fraud schemes and investment of public funds to reduce the opportunity for fraud. So I encourage all of you today, first of all, thank you for attending. Getting information about fraud is really important. Eric's going to give you a lot of great tips and information today, and I'm sure you'll have a very robust discussion with all of the panel members as well. So we're going to hopefully enhance safeguards for public agencies countywide. And I appreciate your participation. Everyone's busy with their schedules and their day-to-day lives, but thank you very much for taking time out of your schedules to be here today, to learn, to ask questions, and to be involved, because by being involved, we can all be out there making a difference with regard to fraud. So I want to welcome you to our chamber here at the Board of Supervisors, and welcome to Orange County, and have a wonderful symposium today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bartlett, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to give us a greeting this morning. We really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. You too. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize some other elected officials who are in the audience. I saw our county treasurer, tax collector, Sherry Friedenrich. There she is. And if we can just applause once after I introduce everybody, that would kind of keep our busy schedule along. I also saw our 3rd District Supervisor, Todd Spitzer, here a little bit ago. Is he still here? Oh, there he is. Thank you, Todd. We need a lot of tweeters today, right? Is there any other elected officials in the audience that Oh, Frank, I'm going to introduce you in a second. So there you All right. Any others? And you are?
I'm Bev Swift, Mayor Pro Tem of Buena Park.
Bev Swift, the Mayor of Buena Park, or Mayor Pro Tem of Buena Park. Thank you. So anyway, I would like to, well, there's another. Oh, Rich Rome from City of Orange, the city treasurer, post I once held too. Thank you. So a round of applause for all the electeds. And now it's time for a word from our sponsor. We're doing this today in the partnership with the Association of California Cities, Orange County, ACCOC. They've been in the forefront of working with local governments and to improve transparency and accountability, which is what we hope to do a little this morning. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my good friend and the mayor of the city of Mission Viejo, an elected official, past president of ACCOC, Frank Urey. Frank?
Thank you very much, Eric, and it is great to be here on behalf of the ACCOC. The ACCOC is essentially the meeting group of elected officials in Orange County, primarily cities, but we also have other agencies that participate. Supervisor Spitzer has been on our board for a couple years, and the overall Board of Supervisors definitely supports what we do. And we get together and meet on a very frequent basis to work on issues within Orange County and how we can do the work at the local level. And as Eric mentioned, or Lisa mentioned, we're the 6th largest county in California, in the United States. Well, Orange County is larger in population than 21 states in the United States. So there's a lot of activity and a lot of good people doing some work. But what we do and what we primarily focus and concentrate on is education. And that's why we're supporting the work that the Auditor-Controller is doing in relation to transparency and fraud detection so strongly. Because these are the things that we try to do at the ACCOC, is make sure that people are educated, know what's going on, and understand the challenges and the pitfalls. And in a moment, I'll talk a little bit about the responsibility, because I think that's one of the things that will come out of today's discussion. Back in the 90s, there was a very famous case in Newport Beach for the Newport Beach Unified School District, where they had a chief financial officer who lived locally, lived modestly, didn't seem to be that pretentious or anything. But after 10 years in the district, somebody found out that he also had a house in Florida with a couple of Bentleys. And that drew a lot of ire from people. But what he was doing was he was signing both sides of checks. And the next thing you know, he's living life very nicely over in Florida. Once again, it's always that last little thing that trips people up. You kind of wonder, if somebody gets away with like $22 million, couldn't they have stopped at 21? You kind of always wonder, why do they keep going? By the way, my number's much lower. So we're clear, my number's much lower. But it gets down to the responsibility of individuals. Not only people who are within government, and I know the Board of Supervisors, they have their controls, they're utilizing the Auditor-Controller's office with their controls. That's one level. The second level, or the third level, is just the overall public vigilance and how we oversee things. And this is where it's going to get very interesting for all of us. because we're all very enthusiastic. We all want to make sure we make a difference. But there is a technology pivot that is currently happening in a lot of our open data laws that is going forward that we're all going to have to be aware of. And I'll just talk very briefly about one major piece of legislation that passed last year called SB 272. That passed by the legislature, and by the way, I'm a technologist. There's nothing funnier than watching non-technical people write technical legislation. It's very funny to watch them do it, especially when you understand where they want to go and where they end up. But basically, what SB 272 is, it's a piece of legislation that requires all government agencies to produce their enterprise data catalog, basically a listing of all their programs that have information that is of a public nature or personal information nature, and let the public know where the data is. So you need to know where all your recreation centers are. You need to know just a whole raft of information. So that the legislature wants that to be public. That's great. Within the next 3 years, my belief is that the legislature wants to take that data and not just say this is where the data is, but in 3 years put it out there and say here's the data, take a look at it. And this is where the responsibility is going to be on everybody in this room. It's going to be in Eric's office. It's going to be everywhere. We are going to have a raft of data coming at us. It's going to be a ton of data. And for activists, especially some people a little enthusiastic, the goal is always going to be out there to find something going on. And what I want to just kind of impress upon everybody here is as more and more data comes to us, we need to be responsible in how we take a look at the data, how we analyze the data, and then working with teams like the auditor-controllers, making sure that every time we see something, we're not crying wolf. That's going to be our responsibility, because the data that comes to us, there's going to be a lot of good information out there, everything from financials on individuals to financials on departments, all the way down to recreation center bookings. All that stuff is going to be out there within the next 3 years. It's going to be our responsibility as stewards and watchdogs to make sure that we're responsible in how we pull the information up, and when we do find information that we think may be of interest, we professionally start communicating with our leaders and with the people working on things. So it's one of the areas that ACCOC is going to be working on in conjunction with the legislature and with everybody for the next few years. But my key message here is we need to be responsible with all the information. Let's continue to be out there, let's continue to be vigilant, but let's make sure that when we do bring things forward, we haven't discounted ourselves so much because every 2 minutes we're saying, hey, there's something going on here. So I really appreciate everybody's time here. I think it's going to be a great symposium. I'm extremely looking forward to it. And I hope that once you get the information today, take that, utilize as part of what you do, and let's work on making Orange County just as successful as it can be. So thank you all very much. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Frank. Now, we could probably do a seminar all day or several days on fraud, so we're not going to be able to cover everything in about 2.5 hours that we have this morning. So what we've done is we've broken it up into 2 panels. And, the first panel is one that I call kind of the law. It's kind of the fear, what is fraud and how does it come up? And if you read the bios in the outlines we gave or provided, we have a very impressive panel this morning. I'm going to give each one of them about 5 minutes to intro them, and then I have some standard questions to start the discussion off. And if we have time, we'll take some questions for the audience for the morning session. The first speaker this morning, or our first panelist, is Damon Tucker of the Orange County District Attorney's Office, who will discuss cyber fraud and especially its impacts on the government. Thank you.
All right, good morning. I guess everything I'm going to tell you here will affect your particular agencies as well probably as your home life. And every time I do this, I think they hire me to scare you. But your agencies and your homes, it's all information that if the crooks get it, your personal identifying information, your personnel files from your particular agencies, or affect your infrastructure, it's all ripe for the crooks to go after. If you don't protect it, it's going to be some serious liability. The attacks for your personal information at your homes or even your agencies are coming from enemy states outside the United States. You got terrorists, you got your activists, and you've got lone hackers. Some of the types of attacks that are out there right now are just the password attacks where people are trying to get into your systems for whatever reason. You got social engineering attacks where people are gleaning information off of open source information like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, most hackers, there's a lot of stuff out there. We can do a lot of damage by what you put out there. Malware, where you're clicking on items and downloading stuff that the crooks can use to access your systems. You got internal attacks from your disgruntled or former employees or your subcontractors who might be upset for some reason. And you have your unintentional attacks in your systems based on your employees' negligence. And that might be losing a computer or a device or leaving their computers unattended. Some of the current trends for cybercrime are the obvious phishing things where they're sending out a wide net trying to get people to take the bait. They use all sorts of scams, eBay scams, bank scams. There's the IRS scam right now that's going around quite a bit. They've got spoofing, where they're spoofing email addresses, websites, and hyperlinks. So if you get hyperlinks in your emails, doesn't mean that when you click on it, you're going where you think you're going. I can't give you a class on how to detect these things, but if you just hover your mouse over a hyperlink, you'll see where you're really going. Just don't click on it. If you look at email addresses, crooks are really good at social engineering or convincing you that they are somebody else. If I'm going to send you an email purporting to be your boss, and my name is Jim Smith at gmail.com, if I change an email address to Jim Smith and change the letter M to the letter N, at first glance you may think it's your boss, but it's not. And it's just a simple, slight change. So people need to vet their information as it comes in a little better, because the crooks aren't breaking down your doors. They're just finding all the little cracks, and that's what they're looking for. Ransomware is probably the worst one going on right now. I supervise the cybercrime unit. I have one guy supervising the cybercrime unit, and for all the cybercrime that's out there. And ransomware is where they put some malware on your computer and they shut you down. If you're a hospital and they log in and they lock your computer down, does that affect your patients? I think it would. I think if they lock down your city or any particular agency, that's going to affect payroll, benefits, you can name it. And what they do is they lock it down and then they figure out how much it's worth to undo your computers. So if you're a small business and you don't have a lot of income, they're going to charge you a relatively nominal fee, but it's going to be painful. But imagine a hospital or a city. How much are you willing to pay? Because right now we don't have the ability to undo these things. The encryption that they're using is amazing. So you either have your computer is now a brick and it's useless, or you make the payments. But that's called ransomware. We have a big thing right now called the BEC, the Business Email Compromise. This is more for private sector and your constituents, but it also can affect your agencies if somebody's in charge of finance. And that's where, again, the crooks are going to glean information from LinkedIn, your actually city or your government websites, find out the hierarchy of your agency, find out who the boss is. And through LinkedIn and other methods, they'll figure out things about maybe passwords, information about the boss, and find out who the subordinate is that does payroll or does accounts payable. And they will send an email to that employee purporting to be their boss and say, hey, we need to wire X amount of dollars to this particular account in an urgent manner. And the employee, believing that it's their boss, will send the money. And usually what they do is they send the money domestically. These are outside crooks doing this to us. They'll send the money domestically to people we call money mules. Some guy in a trailer in Oklahoma who found a girlfriend on the internet, and the girlfriend's actually some guy in Nigeria. And they'll send the money to them, and that guy will then wire the money outside the U.S. If you don't discover this in about 48 to 72 hours, your money's gone. We can't do anything. We have a thing in place called a financial kill chain, which is where if you tip us off quickly enough that your money is wiring out and it's a huge amount, we might be able to stop it with the cooperation of the banks. But outside 48 to 72 hours, it's gone. Nothing we can do. And I don't have the authority to go to Nigeria to drag somebody back to the United States. Things you can do to protect yourself, firewalls, keep all your IT stuff up to date, be aware of these types of trends. Dynamic passwords, and that might be changing your passwords or making your passwords a little bit difficult, using uppercase, lowercase, special symbols, numbers, all those types of things that we all love to put in every 3 or 4 months when we change our password. Educate your employees and your citizens regarding these current trends. Some of you may have never heard of BEC. Some of you may have never heard of ransomware. That's scary because you're ripe for being a victim. And the last thing I'm always a big advocate of is biometrics, and that is unique physiological or behavioral traits that each of you possess that nobody else possesses. It could be your DNA, your retinal scan, your fingerprint, the way you type. is a behavioral biometric. The way you speak, your accent is a behavioral biometric. If you can link that to your use of computers and banking and things like that, then somebody else can't purport to be you, because the biometric is something you simply possess on your own. And that's about it. Paranoid enough now? Okay. All right.
Our second panelist is Tom Reitz, who is a Supervising Senior Resident Agent for complex financial crimes. He's with the FBI's Major Fraud Unit, and he will discuss how criminals and organized crime commit fraud.
Thanks. So again, thanks for having me here today. I wanted to go through, in light of trying to make people as on guard as possible going forward after this meeting, and also my experience that people like to hear war stories. I'm going to try and go through 4 or 5 cases that we've had that entailed some sort of embezzlement or fraud against a large organization, how it was the individuals were able to perpetrate that, and then what the final resolution was. I'll be changing the names and some of the facts, so it's not exactly the case that's being discussed. And of course, with apologies to my colleagues in law enforcement who, every time they hear a war story, are thinking in their head, oh, I've done better than that. I've done a better case than that. That's no big deal. So how do these cases generally happen, these sort of major fraud cases? The overarching theme is internal controls are either not in place or not being followed. And while that won't stop all the embezzlements and all the fraud that goes on, it certainly will stop most of them. The first case I want to talk about is a fellow who was a school administrator recently in Orange County. He was the business manager and had been for at least 15 years. The problem was that everyone relied on him to do everything regarding the accounting for that school, so that when any issue came up regarding money or financing or how things would get paid, they would refer it to this general manager, including upper-level management who probably should have known better, that they also have a responsibility to enforce the controls. How did he perpetrate it? He basically had the checkbook, the bank statements came to him, and he did the reconciliations. So there's an opportunity, which he took, that all you had to do was check the back of the check and the front of the check with the check stub. The data didn't match. The check stub said that it was written to a vendor. In fact, it was written to himself when you actually compared the check to the check stub. He'd been doing that for about 15 years and was able to make off with about $4 million that we were able to show. Of course, banks aren't able to generate those kinds of records going back 15 years, so it's really not clear how much money was taken. How was that discovered? They finally hired an auditor to come in and check the books. They decided that 15 years was too long to not have somebody actually check to see what was going on, and it was quickly discovered and referred to the FBI. So that was a case of the executives not knowing enough. There's also a recent case where the executives knew too much. Basically, what happened was a controller of a company here in Orange County was playing the market and was upside down by about $15 million. So he decided to take the money out of the corporation and use that to cover his positions and cover his losses, because he knew that the executives were paying kickbacks to one of their vendors, so that if they turned him in, he'd turn them in. And what the executives didn't know was, since they hadn't talked to him first, they came direct to us, to the FBI. We made some recordings, we got admissions, and eventually the defendant, who'd fled to a foreign country, returned to the United States under an agreement with the executives that if he paid them a certain amount of money, they wouldn't turn him in. But that obviously was not an agreement made with the FBI, so he was arrested when he landed at John F. Kennedy Airport. That was also an interesting case because he had about $500,000 in gold in that foreign country and asked his father to take it to the U.S. Embassy as part of the restitution agreement. He was turned away by the embassy with a wheelbarrow of gold, saying that we're not willing to take that without any kind of guidance from the regional security officer. It became a very complex problem because then you have a federal judge in Santa Ana ordering the government to take that gold and the embassy refusing to accept it. Then, just to show no good deed goes unpunished, we opened a separate case, charged both of the executives with paying kickbacks to their vendor, and charged the person at the company that was supplying the product. So 3 more people were charged. Another case, I'm going to go through these quickly. United States versus a fellow named Haggard. Again, a slightly change of his name. He had a gambling debt, had a significant gambling debt. Ironically, the company he worked for was responsible for issuing and monitoring probation ankle devices. Regardless, that the irony wasn't lost on him when he set up an extremely complicated layer of ACH accounts to pay vendors. And eventually what we found was they referenced each other, and they would pay each other. And it was an excessively complicated layer of accounting, which was totally unnecessary. Again, a red flag for fraud. We had another case, excuse me. Recently here in the county, where an individual who was responsible for selling homes on the courthouse steps, when they're in REO and in repossession, went back to the winning bidder and suggested that he would record the final sale at a lower price for a little kickback on the side. This would help that person, obviously, with tax basis later on and so on. That individual ended up pleading guilty. How was that one discovered? The folks who were competing with him on the courthouse steps went on the computer and saw that the final sale price recorded was their bidded. They had bid more than that, and they didn't understand why it was that they didn't win the auction if that was the actual final recording price. And then they ended up reporting it to the FBI. So just real briefly, since all of you folks are more likely to be the first ones to encounter someone who's engaged in some kind of embezzlement or fraud at the company, there's certain elements we're looking for in a criminal case. The first one is the individual acknowledges that they had no right to that money. That's not as much a problem in government, but in a large corporation where the person accused of taking money is an officer or an executive who has the right to set his own salary or pay himself a bonus, that becomes very complicated. So the person has to acknowledge that they had no right to the money. Also, there could be somebody who claims, well, I was owed a bonus and it wasn't paid completely or something like that. That they had no right to the money, that they took the money regardless. The scheme and how they executed it, to have them describe what they did and how they hid, everybody here is more or less an accountant, how they hid that debit, right? Because that debit is sitting there on that balance sheet, and if you shake it really hard, that debit's going to fall out. They have to hide it somehow. So how do they manage to hide it? And then how they prevented other people from learning the scheme. In other words, the mens rea, the knowledge that this is a crime, and then what they did with the money and where is the money, and how can we get the money back. Those are the elements that we're looking for in a criminal case. The kind of statutes we use, I'm not a prosecutor, so when I say the kind of statutes we use, I mean what I've seen used is typically mail and wire fraud, use of interstate wires in furtherance of a scheme to defraud. There's also a statute against denial of honest services. That's not used as often. It was used in the Enron case, but there was a court precedent that both overturned it in that case and very much narrowed its usage. The kind of cases we're looking for, embezzlement cases for criminal cases are actually pretty efficient. We've got about a 90 to 95% confession rate on these kind of cases, or at least they just go out and get an attorney and work out a plea deal. Only on about 5% of the cases do we end up having to go through the indictment process and arrest individuals. And the kind of leads that we get regarding these cases are obviously all of you in your management positions who are out there making sure those internal controls are complied with. But we have other sources as well. A lot of times management will be the last one to know that something's going on. There are people in the cubicle cities who also have some suspicion of what's going on. We got a lot of leads along those lines. But we also get mandatory reporting. There's things called suspicious activity reports that are sent by financial institutions if they see something that's suspicious. There is currency transaction reporting requirements by financial institutions. 10,000, more than 10,000 in cash, either deposited or withdrawn from a financial institution, has to be reported in a document. And then one of the most productive documents that's sent to us, casino transaction reporting. $10,000 transacted at a casino. Those tend to be very productive as well. That's where we found the individual who had the multi-layered ACH accounts and was working for the ankle bracelet company, simply through casino reporting. And I understand that was a large part in the Placentia controller case as well. So that's sort of what we do at the FBI. I think, to close, the thing that most criminals have to worry about here in Orange County is the squad that I'm lucky to supervise has 11 agents, and when you add up the indictments and informations and the violations that we work, my squad is larger than the entire Boston field office, than the entire Sacramento field office. We've indicted more people here than those other field offices. We're actually the 10th largest division in the FBI, just here in Orange County. So that's kind of the underside of what the supervisor was saying about us being the 6th largest county. Right. I guess we have to catch up a little to make that. So thank you.
Right. Thank you. And you're right, everybody always likes war stories. Those are good. Our third panelist is Rick Jazaie, sorry, who is with our county's outside auditing firm, Macias, Gini, and O'Connell, and he will discuss how fraud can happen within an organization.
Thanks very much, Eric. I think the war stories you've heard so far are great. I'm a former FBI special agent. I did work with the FBI from 2004 through almost 2007, working on cyber crimes, and I primarily work terrorism, cyber crimes, very little on the criminal side. My background and experience probably will be a little bit wilder than you may imagine. I really want to thank the panelists for bringing up some really important facts. I'm not going to repeat what they just said. They stole my thunder, but just to let you know, more and more each day, we are using computers, we are using the internet, we are using technology to conduct business. And that creates an open door for the criminals today to walk in when we are having bad behaviors on the computer system and start to penetrate our networks and steal the data. Now, if you're in the government, believe me, they're not interested in coming into your network and changing your accounts receivable, your accounts payable numbers. That's not what they're after. What they're after are personal identifiable information, or PII as we call them. That's what they're after. They want social security numbers. They want to find information in your networks, in your systems that can help them create identity theft. It's a lot different. Our firm works primarily with governments. As Eric mentioned, we are the external auditors for the County of Orange. And we also have other large counties throughout California, and that is my biggest concern as the firm's head of the IT. And let me just give you an example. There are two areas that we see a lot of issues. One is the lack of internal controls. One of the things that I'm sometimes told by management is that we trust our employees. I'm glad you do trust your employees, but I will tell you, from an internal control standpoint, trust has never been and never will be internal control. It's not a control. But I'm glad you do have trust in your employees, but you still got to verify. And the second thing is the segregation of duties. A lot of crimes happen, as the special agent just mentioned, you have to make sure there is segregation of duties. In IT world, financial crime right now, basically stealing money from you, is becoming the number one threat. And the average cost, according to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, is about $500,000 per transaction. These are averages. I'm not suggesting every one of them is that much, but there is very, very big numbers are coming, and they're only going to get bigger. You just heard the mayor of Mission Viejo, Mr. Ray, just talk to you about AB 272. I am very concerned about AB 272 as a former and a current certified information system security professional, long name. But that is because I am now have to worry about all these information about your networks. It's now on the internet. You have to publish it. That is a big threat. We are now just giving the hackers the entire portfolio of your network. All I have to do is to find vulnerabilities in your systems that I know you probably haven't patched yet, and I can penetrate your networks. That's really scary. That's becoming an issue. Vendors are an issue. You have software out there that is issued by various vendors. Are you out there asking these vendors to provide you with service organization control too on security? How do you know that there's processing integrity within this software? Just because it's a software doesn't mean the vendor has done their due diligence. What are you doing about protecting yourself? What are you doing about protecting the citizens of your city, of your county? Those are major issues. And lastly, I want to leave you with this. The fraud triangle, as the special agent described, there's really three things you got to worry about. Number one is the fraudsters always rationalize in their head. Oh, I'm worthy of this money. I will pay it back. I promise you I will do that. Number two, they have opportunity. They're in a great position. The special agent just described, and district attorney also described examples for you about opportunities that are out there, and these people are in a great position to get in there and do what? Commit the crime. And the third one is pressure. I am under pressure because, I don't know, for example, I may have a spouse that likes luxury stuff, and that is pressure. I have children I have to put through college, and that's pressure. I investigated a case where a mother had her child in cancer treatment. It was amazing bills that were coming to her. And we investigated that. I'm also a licensed private investigator, so I investigated this particular crime with a friend of mine. And bottom line is, she needed the money. She was under pressure. Good person, very good family up in Northern California, but she was under pressure. And so you have to remember that. There's a fourth element. So go from a triangle to a diamond now. The fourth triangle that I really want you to concentrate is capability. And that's when you go into the FBI or you go into the district attorney, what they're going to be looking at is this person really capable of doing it? And it comes down to the word intent. And that's what we need to be sure. So when you come in, if before you even get to the district attorney or before you get to the FBI, you make sure, and we'll talk about this hopefully during this session, is that you got to understand where the crimes are. Not all of you are criminalists, you're not special agents, you're not investigators with a district attorney, or you're not a private investigator. So the first thing you want to do is identify those criminal behavior. Talk to the professionals and seek some advice. If you destroy the evidence, they are going to have a very difficult time prosecuting. So it's early detection. And so there's, again, back to the controls that we always talk to our clients, and always I speak during my engagements about, is the three, really four, but the three major controls: preventive controls, detective controls, and corrective controls. And the fourth one I would add to you is the directive controls. As a manager, as a supervisor, as an auditor-controller, you can provide those directions to your staff. You've got to employ those controls. Eric, I'm going to end here and allow you to ask us questions, and we'll answer them.
All right, thank you. I have a standard 7 questions for this panel. We can go through it. You touched on some of these answers, but I just want to ask them straight so we can kind of give a clear, maybe bullet point answers to the audience so they can kind of take that in. You don't all have to answer them, so if you're just kind of concurring, so we'll start with the first one. What are and you've touched on these, but like I say, I want to make them a little clearer. What are the key elements that allow a fraud to happen? Or more specifically, what makes an organization vulnerable to fraud?
I'm happy to answer, but I don't know if one of.
Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Let me just start by saying, again, you got to go back to the diamond and talk about, am I capable of actually performing and conducting this fraud? So within an organization, what you really have to look at, I will give you some statistics later, but here's some information I want you to walk away from. From an occupational fraud, again, my statistics are coming directly from the report to the nation from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and that report was provided to you, or at least the executive summary was. But let me tell you this, from an employee standpoint, 42% they steal. Okay? From a managerial level, you're looking at about 36%. And male are 67%, female are about 33%, that's 2 to 1. Okay? So from the organizational standpoint, when you're looking at the lower level staff members, they steal more, but they steal less, okay, from a dollar standpoint. As you go up, down up to the CEO, they steal bigger dollar amounts, but the number is much lower. So you've got to have to be careful from the organizational standpoint. The special agent just spoke to you about a case of a CFO or administrator at a school district. You've got to watch these issues and see what's going on. I'll talk to you of some examples of my former life as an audit director for a community college, what I had to experience, and I had 3 cases of misconduct by public officials that we'll talk about. But that's really where you need to start, looking at these issues within the fraud triangle.
Great. I'd just reemphasize some of the points I made. Red flags that there's a problem in the enterprise's accounting systems and methodologies. The unnecessary complexity that was certainly put in place in the case of the fellow who layered a whole bunch of ACH accounts. The second point is over-reliance on one person. Obviously, the fellow who layered all those accounts was the only one who really understood how it all filtered out at the end of the day. And the school board, the private school case, the board was entirely dependent on one person to do all of the accounting issues. The segregation of duties, these are all classic business 101, cost accounting, management accounting type issues. The segregation of duties, the ability to have control of the asset, to reconcile the asset, or to have custody of the asset. Those have to be separated. And then there has to be controls to make sure that each one of them is independently checked and verified against each other. And in terms of how to mitigate this issue, we come up with that a lot in the FBI. We're now as much an intelligence organization as we are a law enforcement organization. There aren't a whole lot of new things under the sun in the world of fraud, so the best way to mitigate it that I've argued up my management chain is to come into the office and arrest the person and let everybody at work see what happens when you steal from the company or from the city, that you get arrested and you get walked off in handcuffs. So again, if you see any of these kinds of cases, in the early stages, consider before confronting the person, contacting either Damon Tucker at the DA's office or myself at the FBI.
You're getting on to one of our next questions.
Or your local law enforcement. I like their answers.
Okay, no problem. What is the most common fraud that affects local government agencies?
I'd probably say embezzlement.
Yeah,
So-
is that, okay.
Yeah.
What is the profile of a fraudster, and what are some of the indicators to look for? I think, Rick, you talked about some of the stressors. So.
In general, as I said, according to the statistics from ACFE, male are still dominating in that area, especially white male, educated. I don't really mean to be racist or give you something uncomfortable to listen to, but that's the truth, and that's what it's coming out of statistics and cases. So that is really where we need to concentrate. People who don't take vacations, please be mindful of that. Why aren't you taking vacation? Who doesn't take vacation? I can't wait until my vacation starts next month. I'm concerned of those red flags. Auditor-Controller probably will ask his staff to go on vacation because something will fall off. There are so many embezzlement cases that were unfolded when the individual was forced to take vacation. As part of our audit, we do ask the question of how often are your key executive team take vacation? So Eric, to answer your question, there are many red flags. And again, fraudsters always start small, and as they gain confidence and they know the system is broken, they will increase over time. Most of these crimes go on 5-6 years. They're averages that I shared with you with the latest ACFE report to the nation. But I want you to really take a look at the first 2 pages of the executive summary that was provided to you and understand where we are going with this. This is a big issue, and it's never going to go away.
Thank you. Oh, did you have?
Do you want to add?
I'll add, yeah. One of the things that the vacation thing is absolutely, I was not in my head when he did it, because they're juggling. They're juggling the accounts. They've got to constantly maintain that everything's is good. As soon as they're gone for a week or two, somebody finds out. So that's one of the ways. But one of the things I've noticed over the years is they've done it before. I don't know if you've had that experience as well. And the scary part is whoever employed them before didn't notify law enforcement. They gave them a handshake, go out the back door, don't embarrass the company, and you just passed the buck, kicked it down the road. And I've got people who've done it 2 or 3 times, and you go back and you find out that when they got fired, they paid back the terminating employer with money they stole from the new employer. And it's just a Ponzi scheme of embezzlement. So,
A lot of the cases that I've seen, it was a theft of opportunity, almost like an impulse theft. The money was there, nobody was checking, I took a little, I'll pay it back later, just because I want some money to have fun this weekend. And then it keeps building and building and building, and it does go on and can go on for years. But like I was mentioning before, the confession rate is astronomical in these kind of cases, because it's a chance for the subject to finally end it, and to have it over, and not have to think every day about how they're going to cover that up, and not have the gremlins come at night gnawing at their brain about whether they're going to be discovered the next day. I've had agents report back to me that they rolled up to the address, 7 p.m., knocked on the door, saw some activity at the window. The lady came out, she had a Bible in one hand and a candle in the other, and thanked the agents for being there, and was ready to give her confession before they asked a single question. She looked out the window, saw 2 agents in suits and a Crown Victoria parked outside, and she realized it was over.
It was for the audience, if they wanted to get, read some studies or get some statistics on fraud loss, has anyone done a study on the average fraud loss? Or where would we find that data?
The best, for government at least, the ACFE is the one that really puts a lot of this work together from case studies. And again, on the first page of that executive summary, I just want to share with you of the cases involving a government victim. Okay, those that occurred at the federal level reported the highest median, $194,000, compared to state and basically cities and counties, about $100,000 within the state level, and the local entities would be about $80,000. So that's about the median is what they are reporting. But there's more statistics out there. I trust ACFE. Again, I'm a certified fraud examiner, so I do rely on the information that's coming from here. It is also from the, a lot of statistics from the FBI as well.
Okay.
and regarding statistics, I'm not a big fan of them. I think that they're usually mostly inaccurate. For fraud and I'd say sexual assaults, those are probably the 2 most commonly underreported crimes. There's a thing called the dark figure crime, which is all the crimes that are known, but certain types of groups of victims don't report it. Sexual assault for embarrassment, having to relive it. He said, she said, there are reasons that it's underreported. Your car gets stolen, you report it. There's nothing that's embarrassing about having your car stolen, so you report it. So the numbers are pretty good. Fraud is one of those where you fell for the Nigerian prince. Are you really going to go into the police department and have them laugh at the front desk? No, you don't want to do that. You fell for it. You clicked on the button. So there are statistics out there, but I typically find identity theft and any type of fraud is typically underreported because of that theory.
Thank you. And this one is probably going to be a question that a lot of the folks in this room, being managers, are interested in. What's management's responsibility or liability for fraud of subordinates? What is the responsibility or liability of elected officials for fraud and that occurs in their agencies where they serve? I know that's...
Well, just to say that from my perspective, those sound more like legal questions.
Right.
The FBI is just fact witness, collecting facts and discussing, bringing them forward in court and so on. So do you have any perspective?
Not from a legal standpoint, Eric, but from an embarrassment standpoint, I would say I have lived it where my former employer was terribly embarrassed by the news media. I think that's the biggest price that executives have to pay, to know this happened under their watch, and they were falling asleep at the switch, as they call it. To me, that's probably the heaviest pay that they have to incur, and maybe it's not monetary issues, but again, perhaps the second panel, when we have some legal scholars, can answer that from a legal standpoint. I'm more concerned from an embarrassment for the organization and for the senior management.
Thank you. Well, and the next one is, when is the time to call law enforcement? And is there a difference in or jurisdiction between calling the police, the sheriff, the DA, the FBI, or the Attorney General's office? So how would you know where to necessarily take one?
When to call and who to call.
Right.
When to call, I would suggest as early as possible when you suspect and have some evidence that there's some sort of embezzlement or theft or scam going on at the organization. In terms of who to call, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I would call both the FBI and the DA's office, and when you call the FBI, say I've also called the DA's office, I talk with Damon on a regular basis. We'll coordinate things like this if it's a very large case to make sure that it's getting addressed. And we also have cases where there could be better bang for the buck in terms of sentencing going state versus federal. We discuss those issues as well. So that's is how I would suggest dealing with it.
And then jurisdiction in California, obviously you're all Orange County. 781 of the Penal Code is jurisdiction. So if the suspect lives in Irvine and works in Santa Margarita, any jurisdiction that has some sort of part of that crime where it could reasonably be investigated and bring witnesses forward. The issue with reporting it is as soon as possible. As soon as you know that you've been ripped off, the clock starts, and that clock is the statute of limitations. It is possible for us to prosecute somebody for stealing money from you 15 years ago if you didn't know about it until today. And the way they cover it up is because they're reconciling the books and things like that. But if you knew about it, let's just say 2.5 years ago, and you didn't call us, we only have about a year and a half to put the case together. And sometimes these things take years for us to put together. So we need 4 years closest to the start time. As soon as you know, that's our first question, is because the first thing the defense attorney is going to do when we go to court is argue that we don't have the jurisdiction or the right to prosecute because the victim known or should have known that this was going on, and therefore we can't get them because they're King's X by the statute of limitation.
Okay, thank you.
And the statute of limitations isn't designed to prevent justice from happening or to cut things off that really should be prosecuted. The reality is people don't remember after years have gone by. So the federal statute of limitations is about 5 years for most cases, 10 years if it involves a crime against a federally insured financial institution. But also the banks don't hold on to records beyond 7 years. So there's just information won't be available, recollections aren't as fresh, and there's always a new crop of fraud cases coming in the front door. So even though it could be a really big case, if it's an old case, 4-year-old case, and I've got a 5-year statute of limitations, and we're talking about a federal white-collar investigation, that's almost at the statute of limitations as far as I'm concerned. So again, reporting as early as possible is really important.
All right, thank you. And then my last question, then we'll open it up to a few from the audience, is in your experience, can you just give us your most egregious example of fraud in a government agency and how it was discovered? And that's not meant to be a trick question.
I don't know if I can actually say any of the cases that I worked that are people in the audience here are probably affected by some of the things I've done. So
that you can speak about. How about it?
There are none that I can speak on. So.
We don't work federally that many crimes against state and local governments. That's generally more of a local jurisdiction. In terms of the most egregious fraud that I've seen, and that basically tripped over the guidelines that we use to work cases. The United States Attorney's Office gives us several guidelines as to which kind of cases they're interested in. There's several factors: dollars stolen, multiple victims, vulnerable victims, multi-state jurisdiction. Is the person an organizer or a leader of the scheme? With regard to the dollar amount, while this case wasn't a large dollar amount, it hit on the vulnerable victim category. A woman named Linda intervened in the purchase of a home for 4 retired nuns, took the money that was to be used to purchase the home and spent it all in 60 days. Then went back to the main house that the sisters were affiliated with and said that their money was tied up in a triple escrow, and all she needed was another $300,000 sent, and everything would work out great, which is when the mother house called us. And so in terms of one of those cases that just makes you say, hey, okay, it's not a big dollar amount, but this one's got to get prosecuted. Yeah. And it went to trial, right? It's one of those cases where you're thinking, this won't go to, and by this is beyond the appeal limit, this case. It's one of those cases where you think, there's no way this is going to trial. And then you're testifying about the financial loss. That was one of the most egregious cases I've seen.
Thank you.
For those of you, especially in government, that issue bonds to build properties for the city or county, I would be very careful. There is a lot of issues with bond funds and what they can be used for. And so my last employer, when I was up there, we had a situation where the builder, a company up north, and they may be in Southern California as well, I'm not quite sure, we were receiving quite a bit of, and again, talk about vendor fraud. We were getting a lot of invoices from them, and it was making the folks within our construction or facilities department a little bit nervous about what was happening and why there were so many change orders. For those of you who may or may not know, that's really how these guys make their money. It's not the original plan. They're looking forward to the next change order. And so they contacted me, being the audit director, to say, okay, you know something about books and accounts and stuff. Can you go and perform an audit and look at their invoices, make sure there's backups, make sure this is legitimate, and should we pay this or not? Anyway, by the time I was done, I had to hire a forensic accounting firm as well, because this turned out to be more than a 1 or 2 man show. We worked together. We came out to about $65 million of overcharges. Now, the entire building was about, at the end of the day, short of the $65 million, was about a $186 million building educational facility. State-of-the-art up north, where I am from. And it was absolutely shocking to me how they were milking the system without any disregard to truth or any disregard to, this is public fund. This matter was then eventually referred to the district attorney's office up in San Francisco, and prior to my departure, I know I submitted all my work papers to the district attorney to look into and start a prosecution. I hope they will, but that to me, although this case is not done yet and it's still in a lot of negotiations, hopefully settlements and so forth, I'm hoping this $65 million will be returned to the school district. It's unfair and it's unjust for them to get rich off of citizens. And, you know, in this case, we have public officials who were a little bit perhaps not on the right side of the law for political reasons, but that's not for me to decide. That's for the Ethics Commission who's performing the investigation. Bottom line is there's a lot of issues and fraud happens out there. The question you have to ask yourself, where is your organization stand? What are the controls you have? And what are you doing to mitigate fraud at your organization? I served one term in the San Francisco Civil Grand Jury, and it was a pleasure for me to work on this grand jury, and my number one concern was bond funds. That's all I wanted to do. I didn't want to touch anything else. I wanted to know how the city and county of San Francisco was conducting its behavior when it came to bond funds. And there's some reports on the public website you can go review, but you got to understand, where are you standing as an organization and as citizens? And that is our job, as to be the good stewards of the public funds.
Right. Thank you. That's all of my questions, and I'd like to open it up, since we have a few minutes, for any questions for the audience. Is there anybody who has a question they'd like to ask our panelists? Hi. Could you, to this, yeah.
I can hear it. I can repeat it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, with the rise in cybercrime, what are agencies doing to staff up to meet the demand in volume?
With the rise in cybercrime, what are agencies doing to beef up the staffing for cybercrime investigations? We have our very first, with the DA's office, investigator that's assigned to an FBI interagency task force. We're based out of LA because it covers the entire Southern California region. I believe the Sheriff's Department has several officers that are also specific to cybercrime. Cybercrime is, I think, is looked upon and staffed differently than RCFL, our Regional Computer Forensics Lab, which does forensics on all your iPhones, your computers, which is pretty much all the things that we investigate now. So those are two separate entities. The actual hackers are being investigated by cybercrime investigators, not forensic experts at the lab. I foresee in the future that most of the staffing for most law enforcement units or agencies will shift to cybercrime. The problem is going to be is the people that are perpetrating it are outside the U.S. So what can I do with the laws in the United States to go prosecute somebody in Eastern Europe or Africa or China? I can't. So the best I can do is probably at this point tell you guys, stop clicking on stuff, you know, and that's what we do. But I've got my guy there, and he's working, and we track stuff outside the U.S., and we can't send you over there, and we can't bring people back. So the globalization of this is making it pretty difficult to do. Now, the FBI having more points of contact in other countries, and they have liaisons working in those countries, might be able to facilitate some of that stuff, but domestically here, Orange County, I'm not flying my guy overseas. So, yeah.
Thank you. Any other? Our distinguished treasurer tax collector, Sherry Friedenrich. Actually, could you come up, and that way everybody could hear, I think, a little better. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a question I know I've asked a lot of our financial institutions, and it's primarily for probably the FBI. You have the suspicious activity reports that are required by the financial institutions. I was not aware that casinos also had to report transactions. I knew you had to get the 1099 for the tax purposes. Government takes a lot of cash in. As the county treasurer, we are required to accept cash for our property tax payments. We receive a lot of cash over $10,000. Recently, probably the last several years, we've actually put up signs that indicate if we believe that there may be suspicious activities, we would, we may be reporting this to the feds. But we really don't have a lot of ability to do anything, even though we've been working with our bank. So I would like to see what opportunities there would be for us to do that, because we probably receive millions of dollars of cash in here for property taxes, because 10,000 is certainly not, it's a lot of money, but we have a lot of people that pay cash over that amount. Thank you.
Sure. So just so I'm clear, does the county have an obligation to file a suspicious activity report? I would think not. I believe that's only financial institutions.
It is. We believe, we've talked with our bank, and we don't, so we basically can accept all the cash in, and we don't have to file anything. And certainly, we don't take in a lot of counterfeit money, but certainly we go through our currency, and there are some that turn up at the bank.
Mm-hmm. So the suspicious activity reports are extremely useful to us. There needs to be some sort of criminal underlying nature to it for us to open a case. Most suspicious activity reports that are filed simply state that a large amount of money was moved from one account to another account with no apparent business purpose. Okay, not a crime. People can transfer money back and forth between their accounts all day. It's suspicious, so it was reported. Now, if we end up developing some sort of probable cause or reasonable suspicion to investigate that person, then that information is there for us to access. And so what I think would be especially beneficial in dealing with cities and counties is not necessarily that a report is filed with law enforcement that a person used a large amount of cash to pay for a property tax, but that information is available so that if we end up working a case on somebody, we could end up probably, in our case, issuing a federal grand jury subpoena to get that information. So maintaining those kinds of records, not necessarily reporting them if there's not an underlying criminal suspicion, but maintaining those records so that information could be available in the future.
Right. Thank you. Please come on down.
My name's Paul Borzik, and actually I have a question for Mr. Woolery. It's my understanding that the legal definition of fraud is the misrepresentation of a matter of fact by either words, false allegations, or by concealment of what should have been disclosed. So again, the last one, the third one here, concealment of what should have been disclosed. That being the case, does the failure to report to the public the facts associated with unfunded liabilities or retirement by government agencies, why does not that constitute fraud?
Do you have a specific instance, like a pension liability, or?
Let's say a pension liability. I mean, unfunded liabilities for pensions and
Right.
health care has not been reported. It clearly has been in the public eye with multiple grand jury reports, as well as California Commission of 2006.
Right.
And yet, that information is not provided by either the auditing organization to the public. So
Or-
that's the question I'm asking.
Actually, the answer I have for you is we're supposed to keep the books under the rules of GADSB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. Up until last year, the standard was that any of these type of liabilities were disclosed in the footnotes, and there was rules on what you could put there, and I agree, they weren't always completely. GADSB 68, which the county implemented last year, we actually, for the first time in last year's CAFR, the Consolidated Annual Financial Report, reported the unfunded pension liability for the first time ever for the county. And next year, I don't remember the number of this GADSB, I think it's 67. We will be doing the same for the some of the unfunded healthcare items.
But again, your answer appears to be, we were complying with the minimum standards of the law, as opposed to really what it is, which to the public should be full disclosure of what should have been reported, so that a small problem would not become a crisis.
Yeah, well, and unfortunately, accounting pronouncements change very slowly in that process. And, I think this GADSB 68, where we actually are putting those on the books, is a good change, so.
I agree, it's a good change.
Yeah. So,
Belated.
okay, thank you. And I think that's all the time we have for questions for the panelists right now. We'll take a very short break as we set up the next panel. And we'd just like to thank all of the panelists for this morning. Thank you. We want to go ahead and get started here, so. All right, I'd like to get started here with our next session. This one will probably be a little more uplifting because we're going to try to get into how to combat fraud. I'd like to start and say we do have a very robust system of internal controls here at the county, and I do go on vacation. So. And when it comes to our wires and those kind of payments, it actually involves two elected officials, my office, and then the treasurer tax collector, Sherry Friedenrich, who is here. I don't know, yeah, she's still here. So we would actually have to collude, and that would never happen, so. Anyway, I'd like to, if you haven't signed in, please do so. We'd like you to do, before you leave, the evaluation, so we know what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and if you'd like to get some more information, newsletters, please sign up and give us that information as well. Also, our panelists have given some really great information and handouts there. Please take some of that as well for your use. This time we're going to get into the second panel. We're going to talk more about what we can do to combat fraud and detect it. And so we'll get on with that. And we're going to do the same format. We're going to start with each panelist giving kind of a little intro, and then I have some standardized questions, and think up some questions, because if we have some time at the end, I'll open it up for the audience as well. So our first, I'd like to introduce Gary Schons, who is currently counsel at the law firm Best and Krieger, and he will be discussing translating public policy into action. And I owe you a microphone.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I just want to give a little bit of an introduction about myself to kind of give you an idea of the angle I'm going to come at the topic from. I was a prosecutor with the Attorney General's office for 35 years down in San Diego. I started there 40 years ago. And I did 3 years in the San Diego District Attorney's office after that. And unfortunately, to some extent, Jean Pasco's here, she knows this, I kind of know where all the bodies have been buried in Orange County over the years, because I was involved with going back with Supervisor Dietrich and Anthony in the late 70s, and moving through, I was here for the unfortunate bankruptcy, and led the prosecution, which didn't go anywhere, but at least led the prosecution effort with those cases. And now I am with Best and Krieger, and I'm essentially doing public integrity compliance work with our client agencies, which include many up here, and I know there's some of our clients in the audience today with water districts here. We represent the city of Santa Ana. I think we have some work with the county itself. So what I tell my friends at cocktail parties is that I'm now doing on the front end what I used to do on the back end. And by that, what I mean is I try to make sure that our clients, that is government agencies and the officers and employees in those agencies, obey the law, as opposed to what I used to do, and that is prosecute them when they didn't. So that's sort of the angle I want to come at this. I think from what we've heard that most agencies today have good defenses against low-level fraud, at the embezzlement level. We know how to handle this. We can attack it. We have our allies in law enforcement, the district attorney's office, and the FBI to go after that. I think we have fairly good defenses against being penetrated fraudulently by outside forces, like corrupt contractors and those types of things. We can detect that. But what I want to focus on, and I hope, and I know it won't happen, that we won't have anybody here squirming in their seats. But I want to talk about fraud at the level of government officials themselves, the ones that really end up in the newspapers, that cause bankruptcies, that cause cities to fail, like we've seen in Beaumont recently, in the city of Bell, what we saw here, and come at it from that direction. One of the questions that was given to me was, what should public officials and the public be asking staff? And I'd like to turn that question around and really come at it from the standpoint of what should staff be asking public officials. But in my experience, both on the prosecution side and the public integrity compliance side, here's what I see as the sources of fraud and corruption in government, particularly at the highest levels. And that is a lack of policies and standards within the agency, and then audits to back up those things. The other one, the one that I think is particularly outstanding to me, and something that we work to address every day, is a lack of training among staff and officers in government, and ignorance of law and policies that should guide how government agencies operate. The other thing that I've seen, and as I said, I was a prosecutor, and there were a number of cases that I worked on over those years and supervised, where we were unable to prosecute, and that was because the agency or the organization lacked their own internal self-governance. In other words, they could have standards, they could have policies, but they didn't follow them or enforce them. And so when they finally made the call to the law enforcement agency, in my case, the Attorney General's office, we'd come over and we'd say, well, you allowed this person to use the credit card, for example, for years and years and years, or to use the car and not report where they were going or were they using it for proper purposes. How do you expect us now to prosecute that case when you didn't have your own internal governments, when you didn't tell the employee or the officer that they couldn't use the credit card for that purpose or use the car for that purpose? And so that would stop the prosecution before it ever got started. So there has to be governance, there has to be meaningful enforcement and standards. The other thing, and we're getting a little more ethereal here, but actually as we move to less concrete ideas, I submit to you they are the most important. And that is an absence of an ethical ethos in the office or the department. And where does that start? It starts at the top. It starts with the leader of the department. It starts with the folks that sit on the dais behind me here, the Board of Supervisors, in making sure that the officers of the county, or in a city circumstance or a district circumstance, to make sure that those folks who are the elected officials are knowledgeable of and are watching, are the wardens of good conduct by the staffs within their own agencies. And when leadership breaks down at the top, that's when bad things happen. That's when disasters begin. And normally there is a corruption that is hand in hand with the fraud itself. So there has to be leadership. There has to be a notion of what the mission of the office is and adherence to that. There has to be fairness. That is, there is no favoritism within the department or within the agency. There has to be integrity and an insistence on pursuing best practices. And then to back that up as part of that ethical ethos, the head of the department has to imbue, or the agency has to imbue all the folks within that department that they can speak truth to power, to welcome whistleblowers, and to prevent retaliation against those who do come forth. Because what I have seen in my experience is that when we have these large breakdowns, it's because why? Because when staff detects fraud or corruption, they're afraid to come forward. Or when they do, they are retaliated against. And the message that sends is that corruption and fraud will be tolerated, will be covered up, and that in fact those who are trying to do the right thing are in fact the ones that are punished. And so if the departments, the agencies, the councils, and the districts can erect themselves to have that ethos, to welcome those who would come forward and call them, then in fact I think we can move forward with preventing fraud at those highest levels. And let me just last touch upon the idea that we are very lucky here in California because we have laws and regulations that I think are probably a model of public integrity architecture that the rest of the country ought to follow. We have the Political Reform Act. We have Government Code 1090 that prevents conflicts in contracting. We have powerful criminal statutes. For example, Penal Code Section 424 on misuse of government money and accounts. Our bribery and extortion statutes can help us do all of those things to prevent fraud in government. We also have the government code sections on incompatible activities that is often a source of fraudulent activities. And then to back that up, we have our transparency laws, the Brown Act, the open meeting laws that allows the public to see what government agencies do, and our Public Records Act that allows government access, and there was talk about SB 272, about access to enterprise systems. And while that indeed does present challenges to agencies to protect their data, it also provides that data and makes it accessible to the public, and that transparency is to be welcome. And then finally, I want to add one thing because I know we have grand jurors here, and I've had the privilege in my career to work with grand jurors all over Southern California, and in fact, down the street here at the courthouse. I think one of the most powerful and overlooked functions of government is the civil grand jury. That body can do more to ensure integrity in government and our processes than any other single entity in government. Because why? They have subpoena power. They can look at any aspect of county, local government, or districts within their tenure. And I applaud those women and men that give of their time. I know some of them don't even get their parking paid for, but to come down and serve for a year on a civil grand jury and to be the watchdog to ensure government accounting. So I will leave it there and happily pass it on to my fellow members. And again, thank you for your patience in listening.
All right, thanks, Gary. Our next panelist is actually a part of my team. It's the Director of the Internal Audit, Toni Smart, and she will discuss proper internal controls.
Thank you, Eric. As I was putting together my presentation for today, I was thinking that, we always talk about internal controls and auditing, us accounting people do, but what's the message that we can get to all staff at all levels in the organization? Because internal controls affects not only financial components, but it may be other elements of your organization, your objectives. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking about my neighbor a couple of months ago who came to me and said, "You're not going to believe this. He works in the phone industry, and that there was a customer who had said that their phone wasn't working." And okay, that's fine. My phone doesn't work sometimes too, that's common. But then there was investigators at individual employees' doors as a result of the fact that the phone wasn't working. I'm like, okay, what does that have to do with anything else here? Later on, several months later, he told me that, hey, great news that came out of that whole incident. I'm like, what's that? He's like, well, we're going to have a big company picnic. So I'm trying to think, well, what does this have to, what's the connection here? And it turned out that it has a lot to do with internal controls. The fact is that they found out in this organization that employees were stealing and taking the cable out of the phone offices because they had copper in them. Very valuable, from what I find out. You take it to the recycler and you can make a lot of money. And the organization itself did not realize how much value there was out in this cable. So what happened was two individuals went into the phone office after hours, and they actually went and cut the cables out that were providing services to the customers, the phone service customers. And that triggered this whole kind of chain of events that the organization realized that, hey, there's something here that we didn't realize and we need to look into it. My friend was on a team that went out to look into the matter, and they found that, it's not only the live cables, but there's a lot of money going into scrap materials that when they put in their jobs that come out of that, and those materials were being stolen by the employees. They were actually doing pretty well, taking that cable into the scrap yard and really making some money off of that. The result of this whole review, why they had the picnic, is they went in there, they took a look at this, they realized that they needed to put controls into place, they needed to educate their employees, provide training, we talked terms segregation of duties, doing inventories, and they found in their unit they were profitable and they were using the money to pay for a picnic for the employees. So anyway, I was thinking about that story as I'm thinking about today, talking about internal controls. One challenge that in the audit function that we have is that, we look at internal controls on a regular basis, and a lot of people are not interested until something goes wrong. And it takes a fraud sometimes for an organization to maybe look over and say, well, maybe we should have had somebody take a look at whether or not our employees were following procedures. What was the message that was being delivered by management? our prior speakers have talked a little bit about the elements of internal control, and those are several elements, and I don't like to get into too many like auditing or accounting terms, but what we have is the tone at the top of the organization. What is the message that is being provided by the management of the organization? What do we tell our people about ethics? What anti-fraud measures do we have? What training? We could start that right at the beginning when we hire our staff and bring them in. This goes down to all levels. So I think a lot of times we talk about it from the management level, but this conversation should be going down to the lowest levels of the organization. And everybody at that level should understand and ask them, what is it that they think that management is, what messages are being delivered to them? What is important to management? What's the ethics that are being communicated there? The second element that I don't think we've talked too much about today is have we all looked at what can go wrong? When we go back and sit down, have we really thought through what's important to us at all levels of the organization? The top levels, as well as you could just be a unit. I've been in several accounting units where we might just process some claims to the federal government, but we sit down and we think about what can go wrong with that process. It's down to the lowest level. And when they understand that, then when you have that perspective, then you can look at what internal controls that you put into place. I'm talking about things like the segregation of duties, the reviews, the reconciliations. All of that happens based on understanding what can go wrong in key areas. When you go through this process, one I think benefit that definitely comes out of it is that not only do you go through and help protect yourself by ensuring you have all of those controls in place, but you may even save money. And what I'm talking about is that when you look and you really actually thoroughly go through that process, you might find that you have a lot of people looking at one area that you don't consider to be as risky as another area. But other areas that are very important, high risk, things can be misappropriated, don't have all of the reviews going on. So you find that you may reallocate resources. And you save money not only from doing that, but you may have hired somebody through the process to go add another element of control to this side, but you really didn't need that. So it kind of goes both ways. It's about adding more safeguards as well as determining that you don't maybe need as much in other areas. So I'm kind of talking about efficiencies here. All of these controls all contribute to the control structure. I am part of what we consider the monitoring structure in the big scheme of things. Internal audit, we go out, we have a limited number of resources. Our objective is to go and try to get into higher risk areas within the county and take a look. We are more or less just confirming that those critical controls are in place and that they're working. So we go through a process of identifying riskier areas in the county. We have billions of dollars going through, and we take a look to see that we have those procedures, we have those controls, those reviews, those reconciliations, and we're really part of what I could consider the preventative. We don't necessarily go out and detect fraud, but we prevent fraud, because we're in there looking to make sure that those controls are in place that would prevent a fraud from happening. So they're very critical from that perspective. And as part of that, I think what's really important too, as far as a preventative measure with employees, is that when we go through and we do our audit reports, is that you make those reports available to all the employees out there. The fact that people know that somebody's looking at the processes and the things that they do actually will prevent fraud in the future, or potentially in the future if there was some element in there where people could see an opportunity. So these are all elements that we call the control structure. It's the control environment, the tone at the top as you described, what the messages are, the risk assessment, what can go wrong, the activities of putting together segregation of duties, reviews, all of that type of thing, as well as the monitoring, which is really key. So I was here to talk about internal controls, and I was trying to put that into a perspective. These are things that we always look at as auditors, especially risk assessment. I don't know how many organizations out there that I've talked to, and I've asked them, have you done a risk assessment? And they say, oh, that's what the auditors do. And really, it's not what the auditors do that to determine where to go audit, but it's really a management function. Management should be looking at what the risks are, and then ensuring all the appropriate controls are in place. So that's my part of the discussion today is internal controls, and just wanted to, kind of provide that framework for everybody. Anyway, I will pass it on from that point.
Our next panelist is the Assistant City Manager of the great city of Newport Beach, Carol Jacobs, and she'll discuss management's role and responsibility in preventing and identifying fraud.
Thank you and good morning. As I prepared for this, I wanted to see kind of what are some common themes of fraud and embezzlement, and how can we best prevent it. And the State Auditor-Controller does an amazing thing after the horse has left the barn, and that is that they do reports on the agencies that have had serious embezzlement problems. Bell, Stockton, City of Industry, and they go through and they evaluate all of the weaknesses that or all of the things that were not in place to allow the fraud to occur. And I wanted to just quickly kind of bullet point some of those for you so that you get a sense of what kinds of things to look for, as well as kind of reinforces what everyone has already said today. Inadequate city council oversight, lack of proper supporting documentation for payments, no review of contracts, paying on expired contracts, not using a formal bidding process, internal controls that are missing, outdated, or not followed. You can walk into almost any city and say, show me your internal control document, and they say, oh, here it is. Okay, that doesn't mean, as a piece of paper, it doesn't mean anything unless somebody is enforcing it, and I think that happens in a lot of agencies sometimes. Decentralization with poor oversight. When you give employees authority, you have to check on that authority to make sure that they're using that authority properly. Annual financial reports that are late, bank reconciliations that are late, months late. Why are they late? The banks are very good. Everything's electronic. You should be able to see your financial statements every, at the 15th of every month. That should be something that you would want to see on an annual basis. Complete trust in employees. We all work in organizations that we like people. They've been there a long time. One of the things that I learned as a very young finance director, I'd gone to one of these kind of seminars, and they said the average employee who steals something has been with the organization at least 8 years, because it takes that long to understand how the organization works, how the systems work, how your financial systems work, how your checks work, who does the reconciliation, all of those things. That's how long somebody's been with the organization, and they typically have some kind of catastrophic event that happens in their life where they think this is their only way out. Collusion between employees, incompetent employees. Not everybody graduated at the top of their class. Sometimes we have incompetent employees, and maybe they're just incompetent, but you need to check that as well as to make sure that they're not embezzling. The Government Finance Officers Association provides a lot of guidance to cities about internal controls and fraud prevention, and they have some statistics as well. The average fraud lasts about 18 months before it's detected. Higher levels of authority tend to lead to higher losses. It's more prevalent in larger organizations. I would somewhat disagree with that, in that smaller organizations, there's less people, it's more difficult to do internal controls, but I want to give you some tips on what folks can do. And there's a 7% chance that an outside auditor will detect the fraud. So in Newport Beach, we have a $200 million budget. And we have really good auditors, and I think auditors, for the most part, are very competent and they're very ethical, but they cannot look at every single transaction that goes on in the organization. If you want that kind of oversight, that audit is going to cost you $1 million. And it will take months and months and months to do. And 9 times out of 10, it's not going to show you anything, because 9 times out of 10, the organizations are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So the risk assessment, that goes back to what we were already talking about, that's important. You know, what's the risk? How much do you want to spend to prevent all risk or all possibility of risk? That's something that you'll want to consider. So those are the examples of how fraud can take place, kind of in the big picture. And the internal control process is important, and it does need to start at the management level. The city manager needs to set the tone, needs to set the ethics of the organization. But how do you do that? One of the things I used to do as a finance director is you have offsite community centers, right, where people are taking cash for classes, and people are taking parking tickets at other locations other than City Hall. Call my accountant and say, oh, it's Thursday at 3. Come here. Go out to the community center and check the cash box, see what they got. And the fact that the accountant is showing up unannounced, without anybody else knowing, without even her knowing, so there could be no way that that information could get out, sets the tone. At any point, and any time, the accountant could show up and check to make sure that the books are correct. When I started in one organization, they had cash receipt books with no numbers on them. How do you know anything? There's no way to tell. When you're new in an organization, it's really important to look at all of the things that people are doing, particularly if you're following somebody that's been there a long time. They are used to doing things in a certain way. Look at seeing what they're doing and see if you can find the holes. Segregation of duties, I cannot stress enough. In small organizations, it's really difficult. If you have a finance director and accountant, and that's it, how do you segregate all those duties? Well, sometimes you bring the public works director and you say, hey, take a look at the AP run. Take a look at our contracts. A second or a third set of eyes, particularly with somebody who doesn't really understand the accounting, they'll be able to go, oh, well, where's the backup for this? Or I don't understand this, or somebody explain this to me. And just the thought of those questions coming up will spark that conversation, and that you may or may not need to investigate a little further. Switch it up. You know, don't have the same people checking the same work all the time. Again, that can cause collusion. If you and I are sitting next to each other and you're accounts payable and I'm accounts receivable, well, pretty easy. But if somebody else from another department is going to pop in and check on both of you, you're less likely to try something. And the thing about internal controls and risk prevention is we'll never know what we stopped. We will never know what we stopped. But I guarantee you we'll know it if we fail in it, right? And the consequences can be devastating for organizations. So we want to be able to stop those things with just little things. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be time all consuming. But you want to make sure that people understand that they're being watched, and it could happen at any time. And it keeps people on their toes, and people understand that, yes, my work is being checked by somebody else. If you're a council member or a member of a board, sit down with your finance director and understand the financials, understand the internal control. Have them explain to you the internal control system. How does it work? Who does what? How does it get changed? Do we follow our policy? Ask the hard questions. One of the things that some of the auditors found in the Bell case was councils just blindly approved what staff wanted. Well, as a staff person, you think that's great, right? Life is good if everyone approves what you ask for. But on the public side, question things that are being brought before council. Understand what is being paid for. Understand the funding sources. Understand the change orders. As a joke, one day, my finance director came to me and he showed me a picture. And it was a picture of a speedboat crossing the ocean. And it was really cool. And the name of the speedboat was called Change Order. And I as a city manager, was rabid about change orders with construction contracts. I hate them with a passion. You had to really convince me that change order was necessary. And if it was necessary and somebody missed something in the design phase, you were going to hear about it from me. And eventually contractors learned that, you know, if you go here, you don't ask for a change order, you better put it in the price, because we're not going to issue those change orders unless there's something really gone south and you can really prove it. So, you know, those are the kinds of things that you need to be careful of. In this day and age, as cities contract out more with other organizations to provide service, plan check services, parking services, you know, we don't want employees because, as one gentleman said, you know, our giant pension liabilities, so we want contractors. Well, those contractors are just as capable of stealing from you as an employee, and you need to check on them. And the reason I say this is because I will tell you a true life example that literally happened yesterday. I was sitting in our management meeting, and our finance director, who is in charge of all of our parking meters in Newport Beach, which you can imagine there's thousands and thousands of parking meters, and we contract out the management of those parking meters to a third party. If you're familiar with Corona Del Mar State Beach, there's a little parking booth there that had been there for years and years, where there was somebody that would take your money and you could park in the lot. That parking booth is still there. However, the whole parking lot is now automated with little kiosks. One of our contractors decided that it would be a really great idea to stand at that little booth and collect money from people entering the parking lot. I don't know how much he stole yet. I don't know all the details. But again, that's not a city employee. That's a contractor. And somebody called us and said, hey, this is automated. There's some guy down here in a city shirt or a contractor shirt that says he took my money. Okay, so now we got to scramble to figure out, you know, how many thousands of people he's bilked in collecting probably $25 from folks to park. So you have to be vigilant. You have to be vigilant with your employees. You have to be vigilant with your contractors, and you have to make sure that that you truly are implementing your internal controls. Because if you're not, you might as well just not bother. I think that is all I have for this conversation, and I will pass it on.
Thank you. Some good information. And then our last but not least panelist is David Wiggins. He's the manager of our Orange County's Fraud Hotline, which is operated out of our county counsel's office. Dave?
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. We just heard the term vigilant. Let me tell you a little bit about one way you can be vigilant, and you will know what you're stopping too. And that is to operate a fraud hotline. Now, by way of background, 14 years ago, the Congress passed, and then President Bush signed a law heavily regulating, or depends on who you talk to, but I guess regulating the securities and banking industry. And one of the requirements that was passed at that point was that publicly traded companies are now required to set up some means by which employees can report fraudulent behavior to management on an anonymous basis. Most of the companies, in response to this, set up a fraud hotline. As it happens, Orange County, with the robust support of the Board of Supervisors, has been operating a fraud hotline for over 20 years now. And I like to think we're getting better at it all the time. But whether or not we are, it has become apparent to us, as it has throughout both the private and public sectors, that a fraud hotline is a best practice for monitoring the workplace and ensuring, hopefully deterring, I should say, the occurrence of fraud, waste, and abuse among employees. Now, the organizations, both public and private, take different approaches to how they will organize and operate their fraud hotline. By way of information, the Board of Supervisors, as of about a year ago, determined that the fraud hotline would be directly supervised by County Counsel with very significant input, supervision, and advice from the Auditor-Controller. And we've been going on that way for about a year now, and I think it's worked out fairly well. one of the things that you have to do, and I'm going to urge all of you who have the means to do so, to do this, one of the things you have to do when you set up your fraud hotline is publicize it to your workers. And that can be done fairly cheaply. One of the things that we have done is post at various work sites a poster that looks a lot like this, giving people the telephone number that they can call, the website that they can visit if they wish to report wrongdoing of any sort. We also are lucky enough to have a system in which when employees check their pay stubs, they get a reminder that the fraud hotline exists and is there for them to avail themselves of. We also advertise it on the county's website, and though it's a small thing, several of us, if I had one more hand, several of us keep a notation of it on our business cards. One of the things that you've got to set up for yourselves if you're going to operate a fraud hotline, and I urge you all to do so, is set up a way to intake complaints. The most common way we do that is, of course, by telephone. It's important to have that available to employees 24/7 every day of the year. And there's a way to do that without incurring a great deal of expense. I'll talk about that in just a second. We also have online reporting. We sometimes receive fraud hotline reports through the U.S. mail. And on rare occasion, though it does happen, people actually walk into our offices and say, I got to tell you something. And we make ourselves available to meet with people who are in that situation. One of the things that you're statutorily required to do if you're operating a fraud hotline is preserve the anonymity or the confidentiality of people who report to you. Now, in Orange County, we make it clear to people who are reporting fraudulent activity that they can remain anonymous. And we set up our reporting system in such a way that we genuinely cannot determine the identities of the people who report if they choose not to give us a name or a telephone number. That's frustrating sometimes when we get around to investigating a hotline report because usually these people are the very best source of information that we've got, at least at the start. Nevertheless, if you want to engender trust in the employee workforce, or sometimes just members of the public, you've got to guarantee them the right to remain anonymous, and we do that. And I would say that roughly, Renee Aragon might be able to help me with it, but roughly 80% of our reports are made on an anonymous basis. And so we see great value in that. However, there's also a statutory requirement that even if you know the identity of the reporter, it may not be revealed to the public except under rather exceptional circumstances. The next step that you've got to think about is how you will actually investigate a fraud report. And earlier we heard what I think was a fairly accurate legal definition of fraud. California statute for fraud hotlines, there is one, 53087.6 of the government code. It actually gives us a much broader definition of fraud, so that really what we're looking at is fraud, waste, and abuse. Just about everything up and down the line, from stealing large amounts of money to double parking is covered, and we have the authority, the jurisdiction, if you will, to investigate claims of that nature. I said earlier that you can set up a program fairly reasonably, and many of you are thinking, well, how am I going to pay for an employee to be available 24/7, 365 days a year? And you're not. I take weekends off, so do the other people that work on the fraud hotline team, and we have hired a vendor, in our particular case on the East Coast, that all our fraud hotline calls go to, and they have trained what they call fraud specialists, taking down reports and reporting to us. And this, you might be surprised to know, can be done fairly reasonably, I would say, for something in the range of $3,000 to $10,000 per year. so that the only sort of manpower that you will have to devote to the operation is somebody who will analyze and sort through the various reports that come in. So on that note, I'll hand it back to Mr. Woolery.
All right, thank you. Before we get into, kind of the questions that I have set up, I think this is kind of the important, probably the most important discussion of the day. I mean, the earlier panels, I think, were very interesting because you had a lot of the war stories and what has happened. But to me, the important part of this is how do we detect and prevent? So, and each of you come from a different discipline or aspect of that. So maybe going down, and Dave, you can start and then pass it down. And I want to get into best practices. Everybody can just maybe say one best practice they think, a city or jurisdiction might want to consider or should have, and kind of just move on to that, and then we'll get kind of started into the questions.
Okay, well, from my perspective, every city in Orange County should have a fraud hotline, both from a deterrent point of view and for expanding your eyes and ears in the workplace and with your vendors. And it, I believe, is recognized throughout both the accounting and the legal industry as a best practice. As far as getting into the actual weeds of how you run a fraud hotline program, I could yammer on about that for a long time, but I'll stop.
That's a little out of scope, but yeah, thank you.
From my perspective, I think the one thing I would want you to walk away with is that internal control system and that separation and segregation of duties is key. People can't approve their own paychecks. People can't approve their own raises. Lock down your IT systems. Everything is electronic now. Everything, I know we have these massive IT systems, and verify who can get in and change what kinds of information. And make sure that it takes duplicate 2 or 3 people, depending on the dollar value of it, who can approve things and how many levels of approval do you need. And I think that would be one of the things that I would want you all to make sure that's happening in your organizations.
You've mentioned some very key points I was going to make. The IT systems are critical. I mean, we've heard cyber threats, all kinds of things, but I don't think really a lot of us really understand what type of access some people actually they have in our systems, in our applications, to our networks. I call them the super users. Really, they're given this access maybe through an implementation of a system, and through the process of rolling out the application and adding people on and looking at everything, we forgot that that person can do everything. And we would go back and take a look at it, and we're surprised to find out that, oh, wow, we had no idea. From a detective perspective, we haven't really talked too much about is data analytics. And I'm referring to, taking a look at the tail end and looking at what do we expect out of the numbers. It could be out of a process. Any element of what we do, there's some data element to that. And by analyzing data and determining what we expect for outcomes, we might really kind of detect that there might be a problem somewhere that we could go back and take a look in those areas. So those are a couple of preventative and detective things I would recommend everybody take a look at.
Thanks, Toni. When you say best practice, what I always think of is that is something that an organization, an entity does voluntarily, not because they're required to by law. And so the one I would like to add is I think one of the best practices is training and education. Those of you who are public officials know that you have to have AB 1, 2, 3, 4 training once every 2 years, and I know you've sat through those classes or sat through the automated aspect of it. The best organizations I see are ones that provide that kind of training to all of their employees, not even the ones that are required to have it. And why? Because you could sit down in a room with the head of the organization all the way down to the, the least senior, the least compensated member of your organization, and learn together. And what that does is it not only conveys to them what the standards and what the laws are that everyone in the organization is supposed to accord by, but it shows that you're all on the same page, and that there is mutual accountability and respect among everyone. So that is a best practice that I would urge on all organizations and obviously governmental entities.
All right, thank you. Now I'll kind of get into the questions, and then if we have time, we'll take some from the audience. And one that, I've been thinking about, and it's how do you cut through a complacency and engage the leadership? Because, a lot of times, I know I work every day here with people, but at the same time, I'm supposed to keep that professional skepticism and that kind of idea of trust but verify. So how can we address that, or does any of the panelists have any thoughts on that?
Give it to me. I think that the trust but verify is always an important aspect of being a manager. As managers, we don't just take somebody's written work and just pass it on up the chain without looking at it and reviewing it. And I think that goes along with all of our financial information. We want to verify, we want to spot check. It becomes part of our normal everyday process. It's not something we're doing, let's do it, once a year we'll take a look at our internal controls. It becomes part of your process, becomes kind of inbred in you that this is just the way we do it, so that we know that we have the proper controls in place and that folks are being checked on. And I don't think it needs to be confrontational, or we don't say to employees, well, we don't trust you, that's why we're checking up on you. We're managers. It's our job to check up on you. It's our job to supervise. And I think sometimes we get lax when we trust people. We get lax. It's like, well, that's George. He's fine. I don't need to trust his work. He's a great employee. He's a great employee until he steals from you. Yeah, exactly. So, so I think it just needs to be that culture, and that's just something we do as part of our everyday process, just like we process a check.
One thing I'd like to add to it, I thought, well, I'm a bad one to answer because I'm an attorney and a prosecutor, but I forgot about the fact that I managed 74 lawyers for 20 years, which is like herding cats. But the one thing I found in terms of developing a good ethos in the office and ensuring compliance with policies and procedures is that it can be both a carrot and a stick approach. Yes, as a manager, you have to have accountability. You have to go down with the employee or with your fellow workers and ensure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. And that can be done in a proper fashion, as was just stated. But there also should be a reward side to that, that a manager can do. And you need to think about rewarding compliance, rewarding good conduct, rewarding those folks or those units within your district or your city who do good work, and letting them know that. The one time I remember I told the Attorney General she wanted to know, what she could do. And I said, after someone does something well in the office, just send them a note. Because you know what people do? When they get a note from the Attorney General, they take it home and they show it to their spouse, they show it to their children, and they stick it on the refrigerator. And that really means something. And what does it take for the leader to do that? About 3 seconds sometimes, right? So that's the kind of reward I'm talking about.
I would like to just add something that our Auditor-Controller is currently doing, and that's really putting out an initiative that we're all watchdogs of the organization, and really highlighting those that have come up with ideas, that, encouraging everybody to take a fresh look at everything, and putting that out across the entire department, giving everybody incentives to ask the questions, to elevate things they're not quite sure about, and that's a positive thing in the organization. So I just want to, add that's a current initiative, and I think it's been very successful in the short time that Eric has been here.
Well, thank you.
When I go into my investigative mode, it's fair to say that certain people, some people, don't like it when I come around, and they just figure this can't be good news, even if it's not bad news. And the only way that I can break down the kind of resistance that people are naturally going to feel is to try to give them a sense of partnership in what I'm doing. Now, that doesn't work with everyone, obviously, but it works with quite a few people to try and let them know that we are all part of the process by which we're trying to better the organization. Exactly how you go about doing that is a matter of your individual style, but I think it's a mindset that everyone should keep prominent.
Any other? Okay. The next one, and this one isn't aimed at Gary because he's the attorney, but my guess is he'll point out. We've heard a lot of terms this morning, and fraud, waste, abuse. What's the difference between what might be considered gross negligence and fraud, and I guess is there a difference?
Too bad James Comey isn't here. I think he gave us all a civics lesson on that about a week ago or so. Gross negligence, at least for criminal purposes, is basically it's knowing a set of facts and basically ignoring them, and then acting, in ignorance, or it's sometimes we call it sticking your head in the sand. That's gross negligence. Fraud is, in the criminal law at least, a specific intent crime. That is, you have to have what's called the mens rea, the intent to make a material misrepresentation and then to obtain somebody's money or property as a result of that. So, and I will add to that, from the standpoint of a prosecutor, and there's a few of us here in this room who have practiced the art for a while, but apropos of fraud within organizations, most prosecutors are not apt to pick up a case where the fraud is sort of based on gross negligence. It's tough to convince a jury when you have sitting there someone who's worked for the government agency for 20 years and has, a spouse and 4 kids, and is in Little League and all that other stuff, which will come out with all their character witnesses. And the best you can prove is they were grossly negligent. So you have to watch for that, obviously, because the loss can be the same to the organization, and it's, and to the public fisc and to your reputation. But in terms of enforcement through prosecution, there is a significant difference.
Thank you. And then another area that I think is key in, we can have a great internal control structure, we've talked about, is it being followed? And then there's the idea of management override. How does this contribute to the creating of an atmosphere that's conducive to fraud?
Well, the management override is, it's that tone at the top, that culture of what's happening, and there's always the risk of that. I mean, you could put all the best controls in place, but if the top level is overriding that, then that's really difficult to get around. I would say too that one opportunity to, it's difficult when you have the top levels that are overriding the control systems, and I'll refer over to our fraud hotline, where there's an opportunity for employees that recognize that, they understand that when they see that happening, that's a problem and why, and what is the mechanism that they could report that to somebody, and be anonymous about that. What I think is great about the hotline itself. So I'll pass over to Dave for.
I'm not sure I can say it any better, but it's critical that your workforce understand that the use of the fraud hotline or whatever other reporting mechanisms you may have is a vital part of governance. None of us has the resources to get out and police the marketplace, the workplace in the way that people who are working there can do. And the attitudes vary so much amongst your employees. Some of them look on somebody using the photocopy machine to make a few hundred copies a week as just something they're entitled to do, and other people resent it a great deal because they're following the rules and they think that the other employees should as well. Cultivating that attitude and that mentality is something that takes time and something that has to be fostered mainly through management example over the long term. And it can't be done overnight, and you can't say we're all going to follow the rules and tomorrow everyone starts following them, at least not in my experience.
Right. Thank you. And actually, I think this is a very good point that I'd like to stress. But you talk about how management can override the internal control system that's supposed to be in place. So the fraud hotline is something that each jurisdiction probably should have, because it's a way to safeguard that internal control system. It actually is kind of a backstop to that in a way. and it probably should.
Can I ask Dave a question? What's the volume of your input?
Depends on, well, we get, in terms of raw calls, anywhere between 400 to 600 a year. So it's substantial, but we have to sort through those and determine which of them merit further investigation and inquiry.
I just want to add that, it appears that we're a large county and we have a fraud hotline team, but I go to all types of trainings, and I see small organizations that have recognized the importance of having that, and they have hired the vendor to capture that. And so it doesn't have to be such that the larger organizations, all organizations should look at, the feasibility of having that mechanism to report out any potential fraud.
Right. Well, and I think another good point, and Dave made this, is the fact that you have an outside vendor, then none of those calls are coming in to anybody who has kind of a vested interest in the organization. So you're actually getting a impartial and kind of a third party out there who's taking those reports. So.
May I expand on that? I'd like to emphasize to everyone, not only do you get the neutrality and the objectivity of what I think I mistakenly called fraud specialists, the risk specialists that are offered by the third-party vendor, it is a means of setting up a fairly wide net of observation, if that's the right metaphor, without spending a lot of money. I said it before, but let me reemphasize. There are lots and lots of companies that are providing this service in response to the law that Congress passed 14 years ago, and they make their services available for what I think are pretty reasonable prices, $3,000 to $10,000, depending on the level of service that you sign up for. Most cities, large and small, in the area can afford an expenditure like that, and I think you get tremendous benefit from it.
All right. Thank you. The next one is, what is the role of the grand jury? I think you touched upon that a little bit, and other watchdog groups in, covering or finding and reporting on fraud.
Well, as you might take it from my comments, I think they have a critical role to play. It's somewhat unique in California. I've not really studied it, but I don't know of many other states that have civil watchdog grand juries like we have in California, and they go back years and years. But what I think is particularly powerful about the watchdog grand jury system that we have is that it's an arm of the court. It has subpoena power. It has jurisdiction to look at any agency below the level of the state, that is county, districts, cities, water districts, whomever. It can pick and choose who it is going to look at. It takes in citizen input, much like a hotline of complaints, and they play a vital role. I wish that they were actually more aggressive than they are. I think that they're underfinanced, under-resourced, and frankly, in many cases, to my chagrin, and I'm not speaking of anyone in this room or in this county, but in many cases disrespected. That is, they take the time and they do their investigations and produce their reports. Now, under the law, the agency is required to respond in 90 days, and I've seen many circumstances come up where I think the responses are inadequate. They don't show respect for the process, but I think they're very important, and they're a vital aspect of ensuring against fraud, waste, and corruption in government.
Thank you. Any other? Well, I'm going to recycle this question from the earlier panel, and it'll go to each panelist, and that is, in your experience, what is the most egregious case of fraud you discovered or encountered, and what did you do, or how did you dispose of it? So, who wants to?
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. I have to say I haven't really discovered fraud in any of the audits that I've done, but what I am aware of actually pertained to one of our elderly programs here in the county. And unfortunately, it goes back to the same things we've been talking about. There was one woman, she was a superstar of this organization. It was a not-for-profit. She did everything, She was there from the sunrise to sunset. She was writing checks and reconciling the accounts. And unfortunately, too, for a lot of not-for-profits is that they have their mission of putting their money into their services. So if it's delivering food in this case or whatever it might be, and unfortunately, the bookkeeping and the control systems are kind of secondary, especially in a not-for-profit that's really growing. But anyway, in this organization, this woman, she started out, and it's the same old stories that you hear. She figured out that she can go ahead and write herself a check. And she had a gambling problem and other issues. And what started out small turned into over $1 million. Of course, as we know, they get more courageous over the years. They don't get caught, and they keep moving on. Now, this actually was a program that we have what we call monitoring reviews of, which are very limited. And some things to point out, with some of the folks in our, our department that look at things is that what I found out actually later was that there were some signs out there, but they just didn't know what to look for. For example, the invoices, they were photocopies. They weren't the original documents. She was manipulating those invoices and copying food, type of invoices, doing some different things with them, and was able to use that as backup. She received the bank statement. Nobody else was looking at it. She had access, and another note for everybody out there, if you're looking at an organization that uses QuickBooks, take a look at that one, because there's some control weaknesses in that, that people are able to go actually in there. They could change things after the fact. They could change vendors. This was a super user, once again, in the system. Changed the check, manipulated the invoice. She had everybody fooled out there. And a lot of times, too, and what we look at, we always, and I always really push this hard with my auditors, is that you always go back and look at the canceled checks and what cleared the bank. A lot of things that I'm finding out is that if we would actually have done that, we would have found it. But anyway, I'm aware of that, fraud, over $1 million. I believe the district attorney did prosecute her, and she got 14 years in prison for that.
With all due respect, I'm statutorily constrained not to give you any details of some of the investigations I've been involved in, but I can probably give you the skeletal outline of a case in which employees managed to circumvent the normal procurement rules that they're required to follow in the county, and managed to direct quite a few hundreds of thousands of dollars, actually 7 figures worth of contracts to a friend of one of the management. And that's probably the most what did you say, egregious?
Egregious, yes.
That's probably the most egregious instance I can think of.
Well, while it may not qualify as pure fraud, but it's hard to overlook. But the 94 bankruptcy, the investments in Mr. Citron, and then the other top level of county officials who were supposed to be watching what was going on and weren't, like Mr. Lewis, for example, are a pretty good example. The losses were like 1.2 billion or something like that. But a more current example of pure fraud, and I know you've read about it, and we've even alluded to, I think here today, is the Beaumont circumstance. I've been involved with that, not as a prosecutor, but in my law firm, because we represented a government agency that was victimized by the fraud at Beaumont. But essentially what happened there is the city basically contracted out the entire management of the city. So the city manager, all the department heads were consultants and not employees of the city. And then they didn't, and this council or no one else was watching them. And they walked off with, what's been claimed at least, $60 million. And, that's a pretty good example of, fraud at the highest levels, and then the absence of controls or watchdog at the council level.
All right, thank you. We're running a little long, but I think I'll take time for one question, 2 questions from the audience.
Mr. Schons, you've had
Could you come up to the mic?
This mic work? Okay. Bruce Jr. is my name, and I live in North Tustin. You sound like you've been through the wars, and the first question that came to my mind when you were talking about it was the thing that affects everybody in this room, and that is our utility bills and the Public Utilities Commission. And we've seen what looks to me like almost a textbook case of what could possibly be described as the worst corruption we've ever seen in California. You got any thoughts or comments on that? I'll just sit down and listen to you talk.
I have lots of thoughts and comments that I probably should make in this. If you want to buy me a beer, I can talk to you about it. If only because it's still under investigation and no one's been charged. But what I can tell you is, having been a prosecutor for 40 years and read what I've read in the newspaper, and based on that alone, and frankly, I've talked to some of the attorneys that are involved in that at different levels, it is shocking. And it just shows what can happen when at the highest levels, such as the head of the agency, succumbs and walks out of the integrity standards that we all expect of a government official. And it's sad, it's frightening, and the ripple effects, the cost will go on for many years. Exactly, right.
I guess we could end the morning on a high note with a...
Yeah, no kidding.
We'll end the morning on a high note with a question from the 3rd District Supervisor.
First of all, I just want to commend Mr. Woolery, your staff, and the panelists the morning and then the mid-morning. It was pretty awesome. I just took my 1, 2, 3 training, my every 2-year ethics training, and I would submit, I've been an elected official now 25 years in this county. This kind of program should be added by state law to 1, 2, 3. Every elected official should have to understand how to detect and look for practices that may involve or lead to fraud. So I think that we should actually sponsor that as an Orange County bill and add it to the 1, 2, 3, and then make another hour component of the 1, 2, 3, which I think is a 2-hour training now, add 1 hour to the 2 hour, make it 3 hour to detect fraud, and it can be done online. I did it through the State Bar website. So I want to make 2 points because it has to do with the fraud hotline, and you've been talking about the fraud hotline. This is the fraud hotline report. It's confidential. You can't see it. But one of the things one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it is because it was being talked about a lot as maybe a potential best practice. But what I want you to explain is the disconnect between what you get to know, but what I don't get to know as an elected official. And the disconnect because of privacy and confidentiality between setting up a system where I'm now accountable, right? We set up a system, but you get to know information and county council gets to know information, but I don't get to know that as the elected official because it's confidential. So my question to you is, how do I ensure as an elected or somebody who wants people to be accountable to make sure that you and others did their job? And let me give my example and I'll sit down. We settled $1 million for Bustamonte's misdeeds, $500,000 to each victim on Tuesday. And this was because there were people inside the county bureaucracy who should have known or were aware of his misconduct, but didn't bring it to the attention of the elected officials and tried to cover it up. So my only point is, if I am ultimately responsible, which I am as one of 5, but I don't get to know everything, how can I be held accountable? And if you could address that, that'd be great.
Well, the guiding principle for us in operating the hotline is the so-called need to know doctrine, by which we have to make an assessment, and sometimes we're wrong in making that assessment, but information is revealed within management up to the highest level, that is the elected positions, when there is a perception that they will need to know about this information in order to make valid decisions. There is no attempt to keep either the supervisors or anybody else at the executive level from finding out information, and if they at any point articulate a need to know, I don't know of an instance where we have tried to keep it from them. The Bustamante incident was one which precedes my personal time in this position, but my understanding is that when it came to the attention of the fraud hotline supervisor, who at the time was the internal auditor, his immediate recommendation was that the matter be elevated to the district attorney and to the Board of Supervisors. Needless to say, there was resistance to that recommendation, and the rest of it is pretty much history. But Supervisor Spitzer, to the extent that we can make information available to you as to what's going on in our hotline matters, we do in the report that you just showed us, or that you demonstrated you have. You didn't show us any of it. If you feel a need to know more detail on that, our office is certainly open to your inquiries, and we'll do the best we can to accommodate whatever you feel your needs are.
And I just have one item to add to that. Under state law, my office, on any audit that we do, if we think there is something of a fraudulent or criminal nature, we have the authority to refer it to the district attorney's office for that other level of scrutiny and investigation as well. So, anyway, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for coming today. This is really good. I would also like to thank everybody who showed up and took time to spend with us this morning. I appreciate it. Once again, please fill out your registration if you'd like to get some other information from us. And we would really like to get your feedback. We always like to know what we did right and what you found interesting. And if there's other items we left out you thought were interesting, we'd like to hear about that as well. So thank you once again for coming out this morning.
Thank you.